Special thanks to these companies for being long-term partners of this channel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Zach. Here we talk about overlanding, vehicle builds, mods, DIY, all sorts of stuff relating to modifying your off-road rig. And today we're going to be talking about some special suspension from Dobinsons. So I've been partnered up with Dobinsons and they've been nice enough to offer me a discount code to give to you all. So I actually don't make any money off of you using this discount code. I just asked them if they would provide something like this to try and help save some of you some money, because suspension is one of the first things people do, and having a little bit of savings on it would be really nice. So that's why I figured I'd ask. But we're gonna kind of talk about installing this MRR system from Dobinsons, and it's a three-way adjustable system that's really impressive, and you're able to adjust the rebound, high-speed compression, and low-speed compression. And so before I get kind of talking into that, I just want to explain sort of this video series. So I've been doing some pretty long videos lately, and I don't think that's maybe the best approach. So I'm breaking this up into 4 different videos. The first is going to be front suspension install. The second is going to be a rear suspension install. The third video is going to be kind of explaining the adjustability and just how suspension works in general. And then the fourth video is going to be kind of my thoughts after using it for a month, what I think about the adjustability, how I compare this to my Old Man Emu ride, all those sorts of things. So stay tuned for all the videos. I think they're all going to bring a lot of value to you all, and so that's why I'm pretty excited about this series. So if you like what I'm doing with the channel, or you like this sort of content, consider giving it a like, because that really helps me in the YouTube algorithm. And subscribe to the channel and turn on that notification bell if you want to see more content like this, because I post videos weekly and I think it's pretty exciting content. So with that being said, let's jump right into the install. So we removed the wheel, and just to start prepping for removing some of these bolts and taking off the Old Man Emu kit, I took these bolts and we sprayed some PB Blaster on them. So this one right here, this one right there, and then we also sprayed the little screw up here for the brake line, and just a few others. We sprayed this spindle, castle nut, a couple other places, just so that hopefully this will help us a little bit. Our bolts are 5 to 6 years old, maybe even 7, because it's 2015, and we're just trying to do the best we can, since in Minnesota here we've got a lot of rust, and so spraying them with PB Blaster can maybe help break apart some of that stuff when you're taking apart all of these bolts that just sit over time. Okay, so we just started removing bolts and different nuts to just remove things before we start taking out the upper control arm. Up there is one side of the bolt for the upper control arm, and then this side has a nut. So we loosened that up with 2 wrenches instead of using like a socket, because the wrenches allow it to be easy to access. We took out this front stabilizer bar end link. There's a couple of ways to loosen it. We chose to put a wrench basically on this right here, and then put a wrench on this nut. There also is this like Allen key spot at the end that can allow you to hold the bolt and then twist the nut. There's different ways to do it, but we decided to do it that way. And then we also took off that brake line bracket right up there on the upper control arm. So we're getting pretty far at this point, and it's been probably 10-15 minutes. We also loosened this bolt down at the bottom of the strut. So the only real bolts we have left to remove is the entire stabilizer bar, and then removing this castle nut, which is currently under load, so we'll have to take the load off, and then we can hopefully loosen that up and it won't jolt too bad when it's all said and done. So right here is a bolt spot where we removed a radiator bracket. So when you're working on this yourself, you're going to notice this radiator bracket, but it mounts to right here on the radiator, and then it mounts right there on the frame. There's just 2 bolts. This bolt, if you have a skid plate, is kind of shared between the skid plate and the radiator, so that will be gone when you remove your skid plate. So we need to remove these because we're going to be putting a spacer right here on the radiator, because we have to remove this stabilizer bracket because a spacer goes in here as well to help the stabilizer bar go around the new larger strut. I've got to remove these bolts still, but I just wanted to show where those were, and then we'll start working on that. So this castle nut can oftentimes be pretty tough to remove, and so what we did is we left the tension of the strut in place still, so that there's a lot of pressure between the upper control arm and the spindle mount. And so when you remove this castle nut, you can take it completely off of that stem, and then you're not going to have any issues with feeding this ball joint shaft off of the upper control arm through that hole in the spindle. So that's how we did it. There's probably multiple ways to do it, but hopefully this works out really nicely. And we put anti-seize on this bolt about 8 months ago, so it came loose real easy. So I've skipped a couple steps ahead. We'll try to piece everything together, but what I'm going to just do is explain all the steps that I did take. So what we've done here at this point is we've loosened the bolts I previously mentioned. We took out the upper control arm, and then we've put in the new Dobinson shock and strut, and then the SPC upper control arm. So in order to remove the Old Man Emu system, we just have to remove a fair amount of things. So like I mentioned with the PB Blaster, we removed this bolt, which is part of this front stabilizer bar link, and the stabilizer bar hooks up to this right here. Now, due to the size of this shock and strut body, there's a Dobinson spacer kit that slides it forward. I will note that the screws for this spacer kit can be slightly confusing, but all we have to do is use the Allen head bolts for the bolts that actually connect the Dobinson spacer to the frame. So to connect this stabilizer bar to the actual spacer, we have to use an equivalent length bolt that it basically matches to this bolt that connects the spacer to the frame. So these two bolts are the same length, but this one has an Allen head and this one has some sort of metric head. I think it was a size 17. So that's how we connect this stabilizer bar back to the frame. But you want to completely remove this stabilizer bar and do both sides, because it's really difficult to mount up everything while having this stabilizer bar in the way. So we just took it off completely and did both sides. The next point where we're going to remove things is this little spot on the Freedom Off-Road upper control arms was a threaded shaft with a nut on it, but in this situation the SPC upper control arms use just a threaded hole, and so the SPC upper control arms actually don't have included bolt, but thankfully there's just extra hardware in the Dobinson kit, and we found a bolt that works perfectly. As for the SPC upper control arms, this is also quite an easy install as far as actually bolting it to the truck. The most complicated part will be, setting this joint right here, whether you have adjusted caster with this bottom rotating section or adjusted camber with this top bolt that slides in and out. But as for actually connecting the upper control arm to the vehicle, it's just one super long bolt, and there's a plate on each side that's supplied by SPC that is used to space the bushing out from the end of the bolt and the head of the bolt. So you just run that long bolt through there and then tighten it down, and it's as simple as that. So it's pretty easy to actually connect the upper control arm. So as for getting back to the actual order of everything, we removed the stabilizer bar and we removed this end link right here, and then you remove this castle nut on your old upper control arm, and then you remove your actual upper control arm. Now once you start removing all these things, it's not like everything will just stay floating in place and easy to use. So we have a few brake lines on the side here that we need to make sure we support. So a lot of people will just put some sort of bungee cord around your spindle here, and then you can put it on something in your frame or in the engine bay to make sure you can support this. So the spindle stays connected to your lower control arm, but we need the top of it to stay supported so that those brake lines don't get extended past the healthy length. So after you removed your stock upper control arm, you have to start loosening these 3 bolts on the top hat of your strut and shock assembly, as well as remove this bolt right down here. So this bolt can probably be the hardest to remove, but that's why when we put everything back, we put anti-seize on it so that it is easy to remove in the future. So as well as when we put these shocks back in, we have to just make sure that we've put the rebound adjuster onto the shock appropriately, because you don't want to have to put this into place once the shock is already mounted up inside of your wheel well. It's much easier to put it on when you just have the shock laying out in your garage.
So as we know, the 4Runners have independent front suspension, so these are adjusted a little bit different than the rear. So they have this little adjustability screw on the inside of the strut assembly screw, and this is, you know, a little bit easy to adjust with an Allen key, but once we put this on the vehicle, it becomes very difficult. So they include this nice little quick adjustment screw. So to make this easier on ourselves, we need to thread a small shaft into that interior part, and then we tighten down a nut on the larger threads on the exterior. So if you loosen the rebound towards the really loose side, it causes that to pull out of the thicker threaded shaft, and this makes it easier to actually thread the nut on. So that's the Allen key that we're basically threading into that shaft. So that's why we loosen it up, so that there's kind of space where we're putting the Allen key into that hole where the threads on this nut even touch the larger shaft over here. But now once we have the nut actually on there, that's what it looks like. And this little top nut is that really easy thing to adjust when this is actually put on the vehicle. So before we put the SPC upper control arms on, we lift in this shock body and everything into its place. First, you're going to want to set these screws in the top, and then you can swing down in the bottom portion so that this bottom of the shock will swing right into that nice mounting point. And then just thread all the bolts and nuts into place, and the shock is basically done. As far as the tubing on the passenger side, which is what we're looking at, this tube is going to be facing the back. It's going to follow on the inside of the upper control arm behind that top bolt where the rebound adjustment is, and then follow right behind, and then also on the inside of the upper control arm. So you can see that tube, and it's going to come right down to this Dobinsons remote reservoir, which is going to mount right on top of our frame there. So right up inside the wheel well here, we have these 3 nuts, and they actually aren't used for anything. They have little plugs inside them, and we want to knock this one clean off because it gets in the way of our rebound adjuster. And so if there's any movement inside of this top hat mount, we don't want this rebound adjuster to bump up against that nut. So we're going to take this off, and in theory you could take all 3 of these off if you really wanted to. Okay, so we're on the left side of the front of the 4Runner, or the driver's side in America, and we've ran the hose over the top. So this is something that is done on the right side if you're looking at the photos, but on the left side it shows only a KDSS option. So on my TRD Pro 4Runner, I don't have KDSS, but I do have this ground cable and this coolant line of some kind. It's probably for the air conditioning system. And so what we're doing is, there was a bracket that was holding this line in place right there. So originally it was oriented like this, where the hose was on this side of the bracket, and then this little tab was bent down. So that was holding the hose in place. Now what we noticed is there's a rubber hose connected to this stiff line on this side, and then there's also another rubber hose right up in here. And so there's some flexibility in the movement of this hose, and so we're going to just slightly adjust this bracket and then bend this bracket and switch it around on the other side. So instead of the hose being on this side of the screw, it's going to be on that side. So that's going to create enough space on top of the frame here so that we can actually lay the adjustable reservoir right in this section here, because on the other side of the car, this is all wide open and it's super easy, but on this side, you just got to tweak a couple things. So here is our remote reservoir bracket, and we have a couple of different bolts on here. So the bolt in the front is a slightly smaller diameter bolt with an Allen head on it. And then in the rear, we have a slightly larger bolt with an Allen head on it as well. So the rear one is, I believe, a size 6 Allen, and the front one is a size 5. And then we have these 2 bolts in the middle, which don't have an Allen head. Now, this is kind of up for debate because in the photos on Dobinson's website, they have only Allen head bolts used for all these locations. It may be just my fault that I lost a couple, but there's so much extra hardware included in these kits because this kit is used for a variety of different Toyota models that all can use this same sizing suspension. So this is how I've configured it. As far as the left side, it's like a hidden nut on the back. It has a shorter handle, and then the one on the right has a longer handle. Now, where we're going to use these handles is on the frame. We've got these couple of plastic covers that cover these holes, and so we're going to use the short-handled nut, the hidden nut on the left there, to go through that gap. And you can just thread it right through, and then it's a nut right behind this hole. And similarly over here, we'll thread it at an angle with the longer handle. It'll be a nut right behind this hole, and then we can run our bolts through the holes to our hidden nut. And then this bracket will basically be a nice little spot to hook into the reservoir and hold it in place out of the way of the wheel, and perfectly still accessible, so I can reach in here and turn these knobs so that we can adjust the high and low speed compression. So that's how we're going to do this. As far as any other things we need to do now, eventually we'll have to adjust the camber, and I'm going to leave this at maximum caster and adjust the caster down below in the lower control arms. But other than that, now it's just a bunch of tightening down and torquing different bolts. So as for doing the diff drop, all you need to do is put a jack right on the diff. So the diff will only lower once you loosen these bolts. So what you do is you put a jack right below the diff in the center there, and then once you start to loosen this bolt and this bolt, the diff will start to slowly lower. So we just put a jack under the diff, and then you can slowly lower your jack to lower the diff as much as you need to put in this spacer. So Dobinson sends a couple of different bolts and a couple of different spacers. All we need to do is use the longest bolts with these super large washers and nylon nuts, and we run that through, and that allows us to put this little spacer in between the mount and the frame. Now these may look like washers of some kind, but they're actually all just rubber, so those will stay. We just put in a new bolt, thread it up through, and then you have to hold the locking nylon nut right up there at the top. And it's that simple. Just thread those two bolts through, and you're going to torque those to 90 foot-pounds, and then you can move on to the next thing. So this bracket will just need to be bent ever so slightly on both sides. This side a little less than the other side, but there's a nut right under the place where it needs to lay. You can kind of see it right there. These nuts don't allow you to mount it quite perfectly on the frame, so what we end up doing is just bending this slightly our way so that it lifts this circle a little bit so that it's not going to be touching that bolt at all. So what we do is just put this on the silver mount, and then drag a flathead screwdriver on the back just to draw yourself a nice line, and then you can put it in a vise and you can bend it, and it's a nice way to just have a clean bend and not really do too much damage to the paint, and it's quite uniform. So that's how we would recommend, or at least how we did our bending on this little bracket to hold the remote reservoir. Okay, so this may not look too different from the last frame, but we got this all mounted up. We did end up making a slight bend in that bracket there. I don't know if you can easily see that or not, but there's a slight bend. You can kind of see that line. And so this reservoir kind of got bent this way just a teeny bit, but it mounted up really nicely, so I'm happy how that turned out. As for the upper control arm, we tried to center this bolt as best we could. Tried to get like a middle ground for the camber. So it's right in the middle of that channel, and then I, basically positioned this as far positive camber as I could, because I'm going to have them adjust the lower control arms for camber and caster. So everything seems to be set right. As far as torque specs, I couldn't find a torque spec for this top bolt, but I'm sure there's one on SPC's website, so I'll put it on the screen when I actually find the correct number. But we just tightened this about as hard as we could, which is probably around 100 foot-pounds. This was also, I think, rated for 115 foot-pounds of torque. This is rated for about 52 foot-pounds of torque. The upper control arm bar is rated for around 100 or 120 foot-pounds of torque. The lower bolt for the bottom of this is rated for, I believe, like 70 foot-pounds of torque. And then these, I think, are rated for 90 foot-pounds of torque. I'll clarify everything on the screen, so the screen is for sure right, but I just want to talk through it as well. The tops of here, I don't know if there are specific torque specs, but you can just torque those down about as tight as you can get them. And then, yeah, that's basically everything. There's nothing really left to do. I'll mention, since I've already done it, I have these bump stops. They're just a budget option. They're nothing too fancy. Maybe I'll get, you know, adjustable bump stops in the future, but these for now do just fine. Apparently, you can actually adjust the height of these shocks by using a special tool in these notch spots. So that may be something I do in the future if there's like a slight lean or something on the vehicle, but for now I'm hoping this has pretty nice ride height. I have the previous stock measurements, so once we get the wheels back on, I'm going to see kind of how this height changes compared to my old man emu kit. So hopefully it's around 3.5 inches, but with the winch and bumper and lights and everything in the front, it's probably not going to be a full 3.5 inches of lift. Or it will be that much, but then it will be slightly compressed by the weight. So that's basically everything. If you have any questions, you know, feel free to comment down below. I tried to go through what I could as far as the kit. There's a lot of different bolts, and for the most part they go together with, you know, a fair amount of intuition. There's just going to be extra bolts depending upon what type of vehicle you use and what country you're from. So you know, some things were also packaged in different boxes depending upon if you bought assembly or not. So just don't be alarmed if certain things are packaged in other places. But in the end, there was more than enough material here to do the install. So that was one thing that may throw people off, but in the end, you do have plenty of hardware and definitely more than you probably need.
Well, that's going to be a wrap for part 1 of this series. I hope you liked this video and you're excited about the next videos. Part 2 is going to drop here in less than a week, and I think the next video is going to be a great one as well. The rear was even harder than the front, in my opinion, because of all the adjustable upper lower control arms and the Panhard bar, and just kind of understanding some of the rear suspension geometry. So stay tuned for that video. It's going to be a good one. And until then, I'll catch you all in the next video.